Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am here again today at the Rock Island Auction House. And yesterday we took a look at a J.C. White prototype rifle that was tested by the U.S. Army back in the, 1929, 1930. And today we're going to take a look at a second rifle manufactured by the same guy, J.C. White. He actually submitted this rifle in the 1930 tests, but it wasn't actually tested. The Army took both of his rifles in. They tested the gas-operated one, and they didn't test this one. Why exactly, I'm not sure, but we'll take a look at it nonetheless. This is mechanically a totally different gun. This is a short recoil-operated toggle locking rifle. Kind of reminiscent of the Pedersen, or the Luger, of course. Now, the other interesting difference between this and White's first rifle is that this one is in .30-06 caliber instead of .276 Pedersen. So that kind of suggests that this rifle was designed second after the Pedersen rifle. We don't really have any good documentation on that though, so a lot of the information on this rifle is just guesswork and what we can work out from looking at the patents and the rifle itself. Now this did also use a 10-round en-bloc clip of .30-06 ammunition, hence the rather large magazine well area on this rifle gives it that kind of pregnant guppy sort of look. It's interesting that when Garand went to .30-06, he reduced the clip capacity from 10 down to 8 in order to keep the gun a little bit smaller and handier and lighter. White, in his .30-06 version, stuck with a 10-round clip. So after the US military had rejected White's rifles, he actually took them over to England. And in 1932, the British military tested both this toggle-locked rifle and also his gas-operated rifle, as well as his prototype light machine gun, which we will take a look at a little bit later. Now, the British found they had some pros and some cons, but there were some things they liked about this rifle. They found it to be quite accurate, unlike his gas-operated rifle. Now, that's probably because this has a bore in better condition. This was probably fired less. However, interestingly, they found that his trigger mechanism was way too complex, and when they tried firing the rifle vertically, it actually wouldn't cycle. It didn't work. The trigger mechanism didn't function, which is kind of an interesting and unusual finding that really says a lot about the rifle being a developmental prototype. That's the sort of thing that you typically work out. It's funny, White said he apparently was kind of surprised by this. The US military hadn't tried doing that, and it wasn't something he'd ever tried, and he didn't realize that that was a problem. At any rate, it was. They didn't really like that. However, they did like the fact that White's toggle locked action was actually a locked breech. The Pedersen is also a toggle, but the Pedersen is just a delayed blowback action, and it's not physically locked at the moment of firing, whereas White's toggle lock was. So the action on this has to reciprocate about a quarter inch, and that frees up the toggle to open and cycle. And the British military liked that fact. A couple other things they didn't like. One was the mechanism of attachment of the stock to the barrel. Of course, being a short recoil action, the barrel has to cycle back and forth, and we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. But the British thought that the attachment mechanism was far too weak and that it wouldn't be able to stand up to the rigors of combat use and in particular of bayonet use, which makes sense. That's a legit issue. It's interesting to point out that the Johnson rifle, which was adopted by the US during World War II, was also a short recoil action, and one of the problems that constantly hounded it was the use of a bayonet on a recoiling barrel. Anyway, the other issue that the British had is something that will kind of be familiar to some of us today, and that's trigger slap. We're used to seeing that in poorly made AKs or poorly made AK trigger mechanisms, where when the bolt cycles backwards over the hammer, it actually sends a jarring impact back through the trigger, pushes the trigger forward into the shooter's finger. And that can be unpleasant. The British trials report describes such bad trigger slap on this rifle that the shooter's trigger finger would actually go numb. And that's definitely not a good thing. Kind of ties into the problems with firing vertically and the excessive complexity of the trigger mechanism at this point in the gun's development. So certainly, had White been in a position where he could have gotten the interest and the financing to further develop this rifle, that's an area that would have needed some further refinement. All right, I think at this point we should just take a closer look at this. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to be able to disassemble it, but we'll take a closer look inside the action to see how it all works. All right, this thing looks super complex on top, and to be honest, I'm not sure about the function of a few of these bits. These gripping surfaces, for example, really not sure what that does. However, what I do know is this is your bolt lock. So what that's doing, this is a claw that is holding the toggle lock down by locking onto this outside rib on the receiver. Now there's a little angled surface just behind it. We can zoom in on that. What happens is when the action recoils, this and the whole receiver, or the internal element of the receiver, moves backward, and that pushes this claw up, which disengages it and unlocks the toggle, allowing it to cycle open. It also allows us to grab this to manually cycle the rifle. When we do manually cycle it, the toggle comes up, and now what's interesting is when you're firing the rifle, this stays locked, and the whole receiver cycles back about 1/4 inch, and only then does the toggle unlock and cycle. However, when we do it manually, because we're pulling this open, we can bypass part of the system. And it's only when we get the toggle to here that we actually manually engage that cam, and you can see that we're pulling part of the receiver backwards. You can see the area where this was locking moves backwards. And then this is full travel of the toggle. Just like that. One of the elements, or a combination of elements, that White was very specific about, clearly very proud of, and he mentioned this is primarily what his patents are focused on, is the fact that the design of this system is such that the stress of firing, this rearward stress from recoil and from pressure in the chamber, is actually put on locking lugs, like this one right here, not on the pins connecting these toggle parts together. So his development was this locking toggle system in which you're not actually putting a lot of bending strain on the pins around which these parts have to rotate. And that's technically a very sophisticated design, and that's an impressive achievement that's important. If you want to have a rifle like this with a long service life, you have to make sure that you're not going to be bending those pins with excessive firing. So there aren't quite as many controls on this guy. Some of them are a little easier to figure out, though. We do have the safety right here. It's a push button, side-to-side horizontal safety. That's a pretty familiar concept to a lot of us. I expect that this allows you to remove the bottom cover from the magazine, but it doesn't really want to come out, and I don't want to force it, so I'm going to leave that alone. The British trials did describe this as being capable of takedown in just a few seconds without tools. I suspect that is done primarily by using a cartridge to punch this main pin out. But once again, because I don't own this rifle and it is a one-of-a-kind rifle, I'm a little bit paranoid about doing that myself here. So I will leave that to whoever ends up buying this rifle. So one of the other elements that the British government in particular was skeptical about was the attachment between the stock and the barrel. What we have here is actually a hinge pin. So there's a pin running through this. And then if we flip it over, we have a little sheet metal tab, spring sheet metal. So if you were to pull this part of the tab out, you could open this whole hook up, and that would allow you, that would disengage the front of the stock from the barrel. That works. That would be just fine on a sporting rifle, but the British were probably correct in assuming that this would not be strong enough to withstand combat use. So that's something that they wanted to see improved if they were going to actually make use of this rifle. When I cycle the action manually, you can see that the barrel's moving in the stock here. The muzzle is moving. The bayonet lug is staying right in place. That creates an interesting question for how exactly this would work with a bayonet. The answer is, in fact, that the muzzle out here is long enough that at full travel of the barrel, the muzzle is still inside the muzzle ring of the bayonet, and the back end of the bayonet is held solidly in place. This is actually not that bad of a system. In theory, most of the weight of the bayonet is going to be supported here. That'll keep it attached to the stock if you actually bayonet something with it. But the muzzle is left free to recoil when you fire. Apparently that didn't work out quite as well as the British expected, but that was the theory. All right, I do also want to give you guys a view inside the action because it's kind of interesting to see what's going on in there. You can see our mainspring right down in there. It's a coil spring, and what happens is as the toggle unlocks for this first bit of travel, there's a piece connected to this that's actually camming forward against that recoil spring inside. Then, when we get to this point, only then does the inside of the receiver start to move. You can see it moving relative to the stock right there. And it's compressing that mainspring again as it does so. So the mainspring of this rifle is located down here in the bottom rear of the action. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video. It's kind of interesting to take a look at this rifle that was given to the US military to test, but not actually then tested by them. I'm happy that we do have a British trials report to tell us something about how this rifle actually functioned. If you'd like to own it yourself, not with the problems involved with the British testing, I don't know if you'd want to shoot it yourself, but you could if you owned it. And if you take a look at the link in the description text below, that will take you to Rock Island's catalog page where you can see their pictures and their description of it. And if it's something you want to have, you can go ahead and place a bid online. And best of luck to you in bidding. Thanks for watching.